I'm Fletcher Livingston, 29, a Marine Corps veteran who lost his left leg to an IED in Afghanistan. After 3 years of grueling recovery, I was finally receiving my Purple Heart, the moment I'd dreamed of sharing with my family. But as the ceremony began, military police stormed in and arrested me for draft evasion. The confusion was devastating, until the truth emerged. My twin brother Marcus had stolen my identity to avoid deployment, leaving me to face the consequences of his cowardice. Standing there on my prosthetic leg, watching him cuffed in the audience, I realized this betrayal ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. What happened next would expose a web of lies that had been destroying my life for years. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted most, you'll understand why this story needed to be told. The military police report would later describe it as a routine apprehension of a suspected draft evader, but there was nothing routine about watching your dreams shatter in front of 200 people who'd come to honor your sacrifice. Staff Sergeant Williams had just finished reading my citations, something about conspicuous gallantry in the face of enemy fire and wounds, received in action against an armed enemy, when the doors at the back of the VFW hall burst open. For MPs in dress blues marched down the center aisle like they were leading a funeral procession. My funeral, as it turned out. Fletcher Marcus Livingston, the lead MP, announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. You're under arrest for violation of the Military Selective Service Act, specifically willful failure to report for induction. I stood there on my prosthetic leg, still holding the Purple Heart case, watching the faces in the crowd shift from pride to confusion to something that looked dangerously close to shame. My parents sat in the front row, my mother's hand pressed to her mouth, my father's jaw working like he was chewing glass. Behind them, Marcus slouched in his chair, and for just a moment, I caught something in his expression, not surprise, but resignation, like he'd been waiting for this moment. There's been a mistake, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I served. I was deployed to Afghanistan. I lost my leg in Helmand Province. The MP looked down at his paperwork with the detached professionalism that only comes from years of following orders without question. Sir, according to our records, you failed to report for induction on September 15, 2019. You've been classified as a draft evader for the past 4 years. That's impossible. The words came out strangled. I was already enlisted by then. I was in country when, sir. I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back. The room erupted. Veterans I'd served with started shouting about the injustice. Mrs. Henderson from the American Legion Auxiliary began crying. My physical therapist, who'd driven 3 hours to be here, stood up so fast she knocked over her chair. But through it all, I kept staring at Marcus, my twin brother, my mirror image. The person who knew me better than anyone else in the world was sitting perfectly still, while MPs put handcuffs on me at my own Purple Heart ceremony. That's when I knew this wasn't a clerical error. As they led me toward the door, past the faces of people who'd watched me struggle back from the brink of death, past the folded flag they'd planned to present to me, past my parents who couldn't even meet my eyes, I heard Marcus finally speak. Fletcher, he called out, his voice carrying that particular tone he'd used since we were kids, when he'd broken something and was about to blame it on me. I can explain. The MP yanked on my cuffed hands, and I stumbled slightly, my prosthetic catching on the carpet. In that moment, surrounded by the people who'd come to honor my service, being arrested for crimes I'd never committed, I realized that the war I'd fought overseas was nothing compared to the battle I was about to face at home. The last thing I saw before they pushed me into the squad car was Marcus, standing in the doorway of the VFW hall, silhouetted against the light, holding what should have been my moment of triumph in his hands like he'd held everything else that was supposed to be mine. The childhood photo sat on my parents' mantelpiece for 18 years before Marcus finally convinced them to take it down. In it, we're 7 years old, identical down to the cowlick that refused to lie flat and the gap between our front teeth. Marcus has his arm around my shoulders, and we're both grinning at the camera like we'd just shared the world's best secret. Mom used to say she couldn't tell us apart in that picture, that we looked like two halves of the same soul. Looking back, I think that photo represents the last time Marcus and I were truly united about anything. We were inseparable through elementary school, the way identical twins often are. We had our own language, finished each other's sentences, felt each other's pain literally. When Marcus broke his arm, falling off his bike, I cried harder than he did. When I got food poisoning from a school lunch, Marcus threw up in sympathy. We were Fletcher and Marcus, one unit, one identity split between two bodies. But somewhere around 13, The cracks started showing. It began with small things. Marcus would get in trouble at school, and somehow I'd end up in the principal's office too. Guilt by association. He'd forget to do his homework and borrow mine, leaving me scrambling to redo assignments at the last minute. When Dad caught him sneaking out one night, Marcus swore I was the mastermind, that he was just following my lead. It was easier for everyone to believe we were both troublemakers than to accept that one of us was lying. High school made everything worse. Marcus discovered that our identical appearance could be weaponized. He'd skip classes and tell teachers he was me. He'd flirt with girls I liked and let them think they were talking to Fletcher. He even took my SAT scored higher than I did, which burned in a way I still don't fully understand. When I confronted him about it, he just shrugged. "What's the big deal?" he said. "We're the same person anyway." But we weren't. Not really. Not where it mattered. September 11th changed everything for me. I was 17, sitting in AP History when the second plane hit. I watched those towers fall on the classroom TV and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This was bigger than high school drama, bigger than teenage angst, bigger than whatever petty rivalry Marcus and I had going. People were dying. Our country was under attack, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that settles in your bones, that I was going to do something about it. Marcus thought I'd lost my mind. "You want to throw your life away for what?" he demanded when I told him about my plans to enlist after graduation, so you can go play soldier in some desert halfway around the world. For people who don't even know you exist. For people like Mrs. Patterson, I shot back, thinking of our neighbor whose son worked in the North Tower. For people like the firefighters who ran toward those buildings while everyone else ran away. That's not your job, Fletcher. That's not our job. Maybe it's not yours, I said, but it's mine. The fight that followed was the worst we'd ever had. Marcus accused me of trying to be a hero, of abandoning him, of thinking I was better than everyone else. I accused him of being a coward, of caring only about himself, of never taking responsibility for anything. Mom cried. Dad tried to mediate. But by the time the dust settled, we both knew something had broken between us that couldn't be fixed. I enlisted 2 days after graduation. Marcus went to community college on Dad's dime, dropped out after a semester, and spent the next year bouncing between jobs and couches, telling anyone who'd listen that his brother was an idiot for throwing his life away. The last real conversation we had before my first deployment was brief and bitter. "You know this won't make you special, right?" Marcus said, as I packed my duffel bag. "You're just another grunt with a gun. Another number in a uniform." I looked at him rarely, looked at him manned, saw something that made my chest tight with sadness, fear, not just of war or death or any of the obvious things, but fear of being left alone, fear of having to figure out who Marcus Livingston was without Fletcher Livingston standing next to him. "I'm not trying to be special," I said quietly. "I'm trying to do what's right." Right for who? I should have seen it then. The resentment, the desperation, the way he looked at my uniform like it was a costume I was wearing to mock him. I should have understood that for Marcus. My service wasn't noble, it was abandonment. It was me choosing something bigger than him, something he couldn't follow me into or steal from me. But I was 19 and full of purpose and righteousness. And I thought the distance would be good for both of us. I thought maybe while I was gone, Marcus would find his own path, his own identity, his own reason to matter. I never imagined he'd decide to steal mine instead. The forged enlistment papers were Marcus's masterpiece, a work of criminal art so detailed and convincing that it fooled federal investigators for 3 years. When they finally showed them to me in that sterile interrogation room, I had to admit they were impressive. My signature, perfectly replicated. My social security number. My address. Even the subtle way I dotted my I's and crossed my T's. Marcus had been practicing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The real story begins with a single piece of mail that changed everything. According to the timeline investigators pieced together, later, Marcus received his selective service registration notice on March 15, 2019. I was 3 months into my second deployment, somewhere outside Kandahar, when that letter arrived at our parents' house, where Marcus was living rent-free after dropping out of his third attempt at college. The draft had been reinstated 6 months earlier, response to escalating conflicts in 3 different theaters that had stretched our all-volunteer military to its breaking point. Unlike Vietnam, this wasn't a lottery system. They called up men by age, starting with the oldest eligibles and working down at 24. Marcus was in the second wave. I can picture him standing in our parents' kitchen, holding that letter, With shaking hands, Marcus had spent his entire adult life avoiding responsibility, skating by on charm and our parents' endless patience. He'd never held a job for more than 6 months. He'd never lived on his own. He'd never faced real consequences for anything. And now the federal government was telling him to report for basic training in 6 months. The panic must have been overwhelming. Marcus always was a planner when his back was against the wall. Within a week of receiving that notice, he'd driven to the county clerk's office and requested a copy of my birth certificate, claiming he'd lost his identification in a house fire, because we were twins, because we looked identical, because the board clerk didn't ask too many questions. He walked out with official documentation bearing my name and his face. That was just the beginning. Over the next 3 months, while I was dodging IEDs and training Afghan police units, Marcus was busy becoming me. He applied for a replacement social security card, using my information. He went to the DMV and got a driver's license with my name and his photograph, claiming his wallet had been stolen. He opened a bank account as Fletcher Livingston and began systematically transferring his few assets into it. The genius of his plan was its audacity. Marcus didn't just steal my identity, he erased his own. He told everyone that Marcus Livingston had enlisted and shipped out to Afghanistan. He showed them fake letters I'd supposedly written from overseas. He even went so far as to create a false social media presence, posting pictures of military bases he'd found online, and status updates about missing home. Meanwhile, the real Marcus was living as Fletcher Livingston, draft evader. When September 15th came his induction date, Marcus simply didn't show up. Not as Marcus Livingston, anyway. As far as the selective service system knew, Fletcher Livingston had failed to report for duty. They had no idea that Fletcher Livingston was actually serving his country 8,000 miles away, or that Marcus Livingston had ceased to exist. The beautiful irony, if you can call it that, was that Marcus's deception worked so well that even our parents believed it. He showed them the forged enlistment papers. He staged emotional goodbye scenes. He even had mom-pack care packages for Marcus that he'd quietly throw away later. In their minds, both their sons were serving overseas. As a Marine, Marcus as a soldier, it was a perfect crime, really, too perfect. For 3 years, Marcus lived as me while dodging a warrant issued in my name. He used my credit to rent apartments. He used my social security number to get jobs he'd inevitably quit after a few weeks. He even dated women who thought they were seeing the war hero Fletcher Livingston, not the draft-dodging Marcus. All while I was bleeding for my country, in a desert, on the other side of the world. The investigator who showed me these documents, Agent Morrison from the Criminal Investigation Division, watched my face carefully as I read through Marcus's elaborate deception. I think he was looking for cracks in my story, signs that I was somehow complicit in my brother's scheme. Your brother is thorough, Morrison said finally. This level of identity theft usually requires inside help. You're certain you never gave him access to your personal information? I thought about all the times Marcus had borrowed my homework, copied my essays, taken credit for my achievements. I thought about the ways he'd always seemed to know exactly how to be me when it served his purposes. Agent Morrison, I said, looking up from the papers that represented the theft of my entire life. My brother has been practicing to be me since we were born. He didn't need my help to steal my identity. He just needed me to be gone long enough for him to get away with it. What I didn't say, what I couldn't bring myself to admit, even to a federal investigator, was that part of me wondered if Marcus had been planning this all along. If maybe, in some twisted way, he'd been waiting for me to leave so he could finally take the life he'd always believed should have been his. The life he'd always believed we were supposed to share. My combat medic badge sits in a place of honor on my dresser, though Marcus tried to convince everyone it belonged to him too. The irony isn't lost on me. While he was playing pretend soldier back home, I was actually saving lives in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. Afghanistan wasn't what I expected. The movies make it look like non-stop action, all explosions and heroic charges. The reality is mostly waiting, sweating, and trying not to think about home while you're elbow deep in someone's chest cavity, feeling around for shrapnel that's keeping them from seeing their kids again. I earned that medic badge during my first deployment, when Corporal Williams took small arms fire during a routine patrol in Helmand Province. I was just a grunt then, but I was the only one close enough to help when Williams went down. 3 bullets in his abdomen, and he was bleeding out fast. I kept pressure on the wounds for 47 minutes while we waited for a medevac, talking to him about his daughter's upcoming birthday. about the fishing trip he'd promised her when he got home. Williams made it. He sent me a picture. 6 months later, him and his 8-year-old daughter, holding a bass they'd caught together. On the back he'd written, "Thanks for making sure I was there for this moment." That's when I knew I'd found my calling. I cross-trained as a combat medic during my second deployment, the one that would end with an IED and a one-way ticket to Walter Reed Medical Center, March 23, 2022. The date is burned into my memory like a brand. We were on a humanitarian mission, delivering medical supplies to a village outside Kandahar. It should have been routine. We'd made the same run a dozen times before. But Intel had missed something. They always miss something. I was riding in the second Humvee, going over inventory with Sergeant Torres, when the world exploded. The IED was buried in the road, about 50 meters ahead of us. When it detonated under the lead vehicle, the blast wave hit us like a physical wall. I remember the sound first. Not an explosion, exactly, but something deeper, like the earth itself was screaming. Then silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring, and your brain scramble to understand why nothing makes sense anymore. Torres was unconscious, blood running from his ears. I could hear gunfire from somewhere up ahead, which meant whoever planted that bomb was still around, waiting to finish what they'd started. Standard operating procedure was to establish a perimeter, call for backup, and wait. But the lead vehicle was on fire, and I could hear someone screaming inside. I didn't think. I just moved. Getting to that Humvee, with a fractured femur and internal bleeding, took everything I had. The vehicle had flipped over and was burning from the engine compartment. Back, Private Kowalski was trapped underneath, his legs pinned by twisted metal. He couldn't have been more than 19, barely old enough to drink legally back home. And he was begging me not to let him die. "I got you," I told him, though I had no idea how I was going to make that promise true. "You're going home, Kowalski. You're going to tell your mom about this crazy medic who saved your ass in Afghanistan." It took 15 minutes to free him using a jack from our damaged Humvee. 15 minutes while bullets whistled overhead and the fire crept closer to the fuel tank. 15 minutes while my own leg bled and my vision started to gray around the edges. I got Kowalski clear with 30 seconds to spare. The fuel tank went up just as our backup arrived, close enough that the heat singed my eyebrows. But Kowalski was alive, conscious, and already talking about the letter he was going to write to his girlfriend. That's when I noticed. I couldn't feel my left leg anymore. The doctors at the field hospital said I'd lost too much blood, that the improvised tourniquets I'd made from my belt and torn uniform had probably saved my life, but couldn't save the leg. Infection had already set in. It was gangrene or amputation. An amputation at least meant I got to keep breathing. I chose to keep breathing. The funny thing is, lying in that hospital bed, waiting for surgery, I wasn't thinking about myself. I was thinking about Marcus. About how he'd react when he found out. Would he be proud of me? Would he finally understand why I'd needed to serve? Would he see that this sacrifice meant something? I pictured him visiting me during recovery, maybe for the first time taking responsibility for something, helping me learn to walk again. I imagined us finally having the conversation we'd never been able to have about duty and service and what it means to be worthy of the life you're given. Instead, while I was learning to use a prosthetic leg and deal with phantom pain and PTSD nightmares, Marcus was living as me, using my name to avoid the very service I'd bled for, taking credit for my sacrifice, while denying his own responsibility. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, or the long recovery, or even the nightmares that still wake me up sometimes. The worst part was coming home to discover that while I'd been giving everything for my country, my own brother had been stealing everything from me. But I still have that combat medic badge, still have the letter from Williams's daughter, thanking the soldier who saved my daddy, still have the knowledge that when it mattered, when lives hung in the balance, I was where I was supposed to be, doing what I was supposed to do. Marcus can steal my name, my credit, my benefits, even my family's respect. But he can't steal the fact that I served with honor. He can't take away the lives I saved, or the brothers I bled with, or the moment I chose to risk everything for a scared 19-year-old kid, whose only crime was volunteering to serve his country. That belongs to me, that will always belong to me, even if I had to lose everything else to keep it. The FBI case file was 3 inches thick by the time Agent Morrison showed it to me 2 weeks after my arrest. 3 inches of evidence documenting the systematic destruction of my identity by the person who'd shared a womb with me for 9 months. The manila folder had my name on it, my real name, but the crimes detailed inside belonged entirely to Marcus. Mr. Livingston, Morrison said, settling across from me in the sterile interview room at the federal building. I've been investigating identity theft cases for 12 years. I've never seen anything quite like this. He opened the file and spread documents across the table like he was dealing cards. Bank statements, employment records, rental agreements, credit applications, all bearing my name and Marcus's forged signature. The sheer volume was staggering. Your brother didn't just assume your identity, Morrison continued. He systematically dismantled his own and rebuilt it as we've found over 40 instances of fraud spanning for years. This isn't opportunistic crime, this is premeditated identity assassination. I picked up a credit card statement showing charges for a luxury apartment in downtown Atlanta. Expensive dinners, even a weekend trip to Miami, all paid for with credit. Marcus had obtained using my social security number and military service record. He was living better as me than I ever lived as myself, I said. Morrison nodded grimly. The irony gets worse. While you were deployed, your brother was using your veteran status to get preferential treatment on job applications. He worked for 3 different companies that specifically hired veterans. Never lasted more than a few months at any of them, but he collected signing bonuses each time. The betrayal cut deeper with each revelation. Marcus hadn't just stolen my identity for convenience. He'd weaponized my service, used my sacrifice as a resume enhancement while I was still recovering from wounds earned in that service. How did no one catch this? I asked. How does someone just stop existing and start being someone else? That's the genius of his approach, Morrison admitted. Your brother picked the perfect victim. You were deployed overseas with limited communication home. You weren't using credit or applying for jobs or doing any of the normal things that would create conflicts in the system. For 3 years, you barely existed in civilian databases, while Marcus lived a full life as you. He pulled out another document, my military service record, or what was supposed to be my military service record. Instead of showing my actual deployments and commendations, it had been flagged with a draft evasion notation that superseded everything else. This is why you were arrested at your ceremony, Morrison explained. The system showed Fletcher Livingston as a draft evader who'd been living underground since 2019. Your actual military service was buried under layers of false documentation. When the Selective Service finally caught up with you, they had no idea the real Fletcher Livingston was a decorated veteran. I stared at the file that represented the theft of my entire existence. How do I prove I'm me? That's where it gets complicated, Morrison said. Normally, identity theft victims can point to the fraud and say that wasn't me. But in this case, your brother was so thorough that he's created reasonable doubt about which twin is which. He's maintained for 4 years that he's the real Fletcher, that your Marcus trying to steal his identity to cover up draft evasion. The room seemed to tilt. He's claiming I'm the imposter. He's claiming you're the twin brother who dodged the draft and are now trying to assume his identity to avoid prosecution. He says he's been living as Fletcher Livingston because he is Fletcher Livingston, and that you've been living overseas as Marcus to avoid military service. The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus had stolen my identity so completely that he was now claiming ownership of it, painting me as the criminal trying to steal his life. He'd turned the entire situation inside out, making himself the victim of the very crime he'd committed. But there's evidence, I protested. Military records, medical files from Walter Reed, photographs from my deployments, all of which he claims belong to him, Morrison interrupted. He says you're the brother who stayed home while he served overseas. He's got explanations for everything, Fletcher. And after 4 years of living as you, he's got a paper trail to back up his claims. Morrison pulled out the final document in the Staker sworn affidavit signed Fletcher Marcus Livingston, in Marcus's handwriting, detailing his version of events. According to his statement, he was the patriotic brother who'd enlisted after 9/11, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and been wounded in service to his country. I was the coward who'd assumed his identity to avoid the draft, living overseas under his name while he recovered from combat injuries. It was my life story, told in Marcus's voice, with our roles reversed. The question, Morrison said, closing the file, is how do we prove which twin is telling the truth when both of you have been living as Fletcher Livingston? I looked at this federal agent who held my future in his hands and realized that Marcus's greatest theft wasn't my name or my credit or even my benefits. He'd stolen my ability to prove who I was. After 4 years of systematic deception, the line between Fletcher and Marcus had been blurred so thoroughly that even the FBI wasn't sure which one was real. Agent Morrison, I said finally, how long have you been married? He looked surprised. 15 years. Why do you have kids? 2 daughters. If someone accused you of being an imposter, if they claimed your wife and children belonged to them, how would you prove they were wrong? Morrison considered this. I'd point to years of shared experiences, intimate knowledge, emotional connections that can't be faked. Exactly, I said. Marcus can forge documents and steal records and even convince government databases that he's me, but he can't steal my memories. He wasn't there when Corporal Williams bled out in my arms. He didn't wake up in Walter Reed with half his leg gone. He never learned to walk on a prosthetic, or lived with phantom pain, or earned the respect of men who would die for their brothers. I leaned forward, meeting Morrison's eyes. Marcus might be able to fake being Fletcher Livingston on paper, but he could never fake being the Marine who earned that Purple Heart. And that's how you're going to catch him. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something that looked like hope in the federal agent's eyes. He reopened the file and grabbed a pen. Tell me about Afghanistan, he said. Tell me everything Marcus could never know. The family Christmas card from 2019 still sits in my wallet, creased and faded from 3 years of carrying it through to deployments and countless medical appointments. In the photo, we're all smiling at the camera mom in her red sweater, Dad with his arm around her shoulders, Marcus and me flanking them like bookends. It was taken 2 weeks before I shipped out for my second deployment. Back when I still believed family meant something unbreakable. It would be our last photo together. I decided to confront my parents 3 days after Agent Morrison told me the scope of Marcus's deception. I needed to hear it from them, needed to understand how they could have watched their son steal his brother's identity and done nothing to stop it. I found them in the same kitchen where Marcus and I had shared breakfast before school every morning for 18 years. Mom was washing dishes. Her movements mechanical and precise, the way they got when she was trying not to think about something. Dad sat at the table reading the newspaper, though I could tell he wasn't actually seeing the words. We need to talk, I said. Mom single quotes est, shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn round. Dad folded his paper with deliberate care, the way he did everything when he was preparing for an unpleasant conversation. Fletcher, Dad started, but I cut him off. Just don't. I know what Marcus did. I know you know what Marcus did. What I need to understand is how you let it happen. Mom finally turned around, and I was shocked to see how much she'd aged. The woman in that Christmas photo had been vibrant, confident. The woman standing at the sink looked like she'd been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders for 3 years. You don't understand, she said quietly. It's not that simple. Actually, it is that simple, I said. Your son stole my identity to avoid military service while I was bleeding for my country in Afghanistan. You knew about it, and you said nothing. How is that complicated? Dad stood up, his jaw working the way it did when he was about to lose his temper. You think we wanted this? You think we chose for our family to fall apart? You chose Marcus, I said. You've been choosing Marcus over me since we were kids, and this is just the logical conclusion. The words hung in the air like a slap. Mom started crying, not the dramatic sobs she'd used to manipulate us as children, but quiet tears that seemed to come from some deep well of grief I'd never seen before. That's not fair, Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo Agent Morrison had given me Marcus at a bar in Atlanta, laughing with friends, wearing a Marines t-shirt he'd ordered online. This was taken 6 months after I lost my leg. While I was learning to walk again, Marcus was playing War Hero at happy hour. Mom sat down heavily at the kitchen table, her face in her hands. We didn't know it would go this far. How far did you think identity theft goes, Mom? What did you think was going to happen when the government eventually figured out there were 2 Fletcher Livingstons? We thought you'd work it out between yourselves, Dad said. We thought when you came home, you boys would sit down and fix whatever mistake had been made. I stared at him in disbelief. Mistake, Dad. Marcus committed federal crimes. Multiple felonies. This isn't a misunderstanding between bros, it's systematic fraud. He was scared, Mom said, finally looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. When he got that draft notice, he was terrified. You were already serving. You were already the hero. He just wanted to be you for a while. The words cut deeper than any I'd blast. So you helped him steal my life because it was easier than dealing with his cowardice. We helped him because he's our son, Dad said. Just like you're our son. No, I said. You helped him because he's the son who stayed home. The son who needed you. The son who made you feel necessary. I pulled out the Christmas card and placed it on the table between us. Do you remember taking this picture? Do you remember how proud you were to have 2 sons serving their country? Mum picked up the photo with shaking hands. Marcus told us he'd enlisted. He showed us papers he forged using my identity. I said, Mom, I was already deployed when this picture was taken. I was already serving in Afghanistan. There was never a second son in the military. There was only ever one son, willing to sacrifice for something larger than himself. And one son, willing to steal from his brother, rather than face his responsibilities. Dad slammed his hand on the table. You want to know the truth, Fletcher? You want to know why we didn't stop him? Because we were tired of watching our family be torn apart by your need to be the hero. The words hit like a physical blow. My need to be the hero. Everything was always about Fletcher the Marine, Fletcher the war hero, Fletcher the decorated veteran. Dad continued. Do you have any idea what it was like for Marcus to live in the shadow of that? Do you know what it did to him to watch everyone praise you for abandoning your family? I didn't abandon anyone, I said. I served my country. You served your ego, Mom said quietly. And Marcus paid the price for it. I stood there in the kitchen where I'd grown up, surrounded by the same appliances and photographs and memories that had shaped the first 18 years of my life, and realized that my parents had been rewriting history for so long that they'd convinced themselves their own lies were true. In their version of events, Marcus was the victim, the overlooked son who'd been driven to desperate measures by his brother's selfishness. I was the villain, the glory-seeking sibling who'd forced Marcus into identity theft by making him feel inadequate. They'd spent 3 years justifying the unjustifiable, rationalizing the theft of my identity as somehow being my fault for having an identity worth stealing. I lost my leg, I said quietly. I almost died serving this country. And your response is to tell me that I'm selfish for making Marcus feel bad about himself. Your response is to send your brother to prison. Dad shot back. I picked up the Christmas card and put it back in my wallet. My response is to reclaim my life from someone who stole it. If that means Marcus faces consequences for his choices, then that's what happens. But I won't sacrifice my future to protect his past anymore. I headed for the door, then turned back one last time. When you took that picture, you had 2 sons. One who was willing to die for his principles, and one who was willing to steal from his brother to avoid living up to his own. You chose to protect the thief and blame the victim. Don't pretend that was anything other than what it was. The last thing I heard as I left was Mom crying again, but this time it sounded different. Less like grief and more like recognition. Like maybe, for the first time in 3 years, she was seeing the situation clearly, but it was too late for clarity. The damage was done. The lines were drawn. And I was done being the son who sacrificed everything so the rest of my family could pretend. Their choices didn't have consequences. Some fractures can't be repaired. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal. And sometimes, the family you're born into isn't the family that will stand by you when it matters most. The bank statements Agent Morrison spread across the table read like a roadmap of systematic theft. 23 months of disability payments. 36 months of VA compensation. Military pay from my second deployment that should have been waiting for me when I returned. All of it diverted into accounts Marcus had opened using my name and social security number. The numbers were staggering. Over $127,000 stolen during the time I was deployed and recovering from my injuries. Money I'd earned by bleeding for my country, taken by someone who'd never worn a uniform or fired a shot in anger. He was sophisticated about it, Agent Morrison explained, pointing to a series of electronic transfers. Your brother didn't just steal your identity, he hijacked your entire financial life. Look at this. The statement showed automatic deposits from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Defense, and even the Social Security Administration. Marcus had filed disability claims in my name, using my medical records from Walter Reed to document injuries he'd never sustained. He'd applied for combat pay bonuses, hazard duty supplements, and overseas deployment allowances for service he'd never performed. This one's particularly brazen, Morrison said, highlighting a deposit for $15,000. That's a Purple Heart disability payment. Your brother filed for enhanced compensation based on combat injuries, using your actual medical records as supporting documentation. I stared at the number until my eyes watered. $15,000 for the leg I'd lost, saving Private Kowalski. Money I'd never seen, claimed by someone who'd never been shot at. Never held a dying soldier. Never woken up screaming from phantom pain in a limb that no longer existed. Where's the money now? I asked. Morrison flipped through several pages. Gone. Your brother spent everything as fast as it came in. Expensive apartments, luxury cars, vacations, gambling debts. He was living like a trust fund kid on your military benefits. The rental agreements were the worst part. Marcus had used my veteran status to get priority placement in high-end apartment complexes that offered military housing assistance. He'd lived in places I could never afford on my actual military pay, all while telling landlords stories about his heroic service in Afghanistan and his ongoing recovery from combat injuries. One lease application included a sob story about needing a ground-floor apartment because of his service-connected mobility issues. Marcus had written 3 paragraphs about the challenges of adjusting to civilian life with a prosthetic leg. My challenges. My pain to secure a luxury apartment in downtown Atlanta's most exclusive district. He even had the nerve to request military housing assistance. Morrison said, "That's a federal program designed to help veterans transition back to civilian life. Your brother collected $2,800 a month for 18 months based on disabilities he doesn't have." The credit cards were almost as bad. Marcus had opened 7 different accounts using my name and military service record. He'd maxed out every one of them, running up nearly $40,000 in debt for everything from designer clothes to weekend trips to Las Vegas. When I was learning to walk again at Walter Reed, Marcus was living it up in penthouse suites charged to my credit. The interesting thing, Morrison continued, is how he managed the timing. Your brother clearly studied your deployment schedule and injury timeline. He started the financial fraud the moment you were wounded, when he knew you'd be incapacitated and unable to monitor your accounts. I found my voice. He was waiting for me to get hurt. The evidence suggests he was monitoring military casualty reports. We found searches on his computer for Afghanistan casualties and wounded Marines dating back to your deployment. He knew about your injury before your parents did. The betrayal took on a new dimension. Marcus hadn't just opportunistically stolen from me. He'd been watching, waiting for the moment when I'd be too broken to defend myself. My combat injury wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the business opportunity he'd been hoping for. "There's more," Morrison said grimly. He pulled out a series of documents I recognized as VA claim forms. Your brother didn't just steal existing benefits. He filed for additional compensation using your service record. Mental health claims, chronic pain management, even requests for specialized medical equipment. The forms were filled out in Marcus's handwriting but signed with my name. Under "Describe your service-connected disabilities." He'd written detailed accounts of PTSD symptoms, phantom limb pain, and mobility challenges. He'd described sleepless nights, anxiety attacks, and depression with the kind of clinical precision that comes from research, not experience. He was collecting mental health benefits for trauma he never experienced, I said. "And using your actual therapy records to support the claims," Morrison confirmed. "Your brother had access to your medical files through the family emergency contact system. He used your real symptoms to document fake claims, then pocketed the compensation payments." The cruelest irony was that Marcus was being paid to recover from wounds he'd never received, while I was struggling with real PTSD and phantom pain without any of the financial support I'd earned. He was living comfortably on money meant to help me rebuild my life after sacrificing my body for my country. "How much total?" I asked. Morrison did some quick math on his calculator. "Including direct theft, fraudulent claims, credit card debt, and compound interest, your brother stole approximately $180,000 from you over 3 years. That doesn't include the damage to your credit score or the benefits you're still entitled to receive. $180,000. The price Marcus had put on his brother's life in service. Less than $60,000 a year to completely destroy someone's identity and financial future. "Can I get it back?" "Some of it," Morrison said. "The VA benefits will be restored once we clear up the identity issues. The stolen military pay will eventually be reimbursed, but the credit card debt is trickier technically. You're liable for those charges until we can prove fraud in court." I looked at the pile of financial documents that represented 3 years of theft and betrayal. Marcus hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my future. The apartment I should have been able to afford. The car I should have been able to buy. The financial security that should have helped me transition back to civilian life. Instead, I was living in a studio apartment, above a convenience store, driving a 15-year-old Honda with a manual transmission I could barely operate with my prosthetic leg, and working part-time at a VA hospital for $12 an hour, because my credit was too damaged to qualify for better employment. "Agent Morrison," I said, "I want every penny back. I want interests, penalties, and damages. And I want Marcus to pay for what he stole from every other veteran whose identity he might have considered stealing. Morrison nodded and began gathering the documents. That's exactly what we're going to do. Your brother picked the wrong veteran to rob. As I watched him stack the evidence of Marcus's systematic theft, I realized this was about more than money. This was about the principle that service should be honored, not exploited. That sacrifice should be respected, not stolen. That no veteran should have to fight their own family for the benefits they earned with their blood. Marcus had bet that I'd be too broken, or too ashamed, or too afraid to fight back. He'd underestimated the same determination that kept me moving when shrapnel tore through my leg. The same resolve that made me choose amputation over death. He was about to learn that stealing from a Marine is a lot more dangerous than stealing from your brother. The attorney's business card was worn smooth from the number of times I'd pulled it out of my wallet over the past month. Rebecca Chen, military defense attorney, in simple black text on cream colored stock. Agent Morrison had recommended her after our third meeting, when it became clear that Marcus's deception was too complex for a public defender to untangle. Your case is unique, Chen said during our first consultation in her downtown office. Most identity theft cases involve strangers. Family identity theft, especially between twins, creates legal complexities I've never encountered. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s. But there was something about the way she organized documents and asked questions that made me trust her immediately. On her wall hung a photograph of her in dress blues Navy JAG Corps. According to the caption, "You served?" I asked. 8 years, she said. 2 deployments to Iraq. I understand what Marcus stole from you, beyond just money and credit scores. That's when I knew I'd found the right lawyer. Chen spread Marcus's false documentation across her conference table, like a prosecutor laying out evidence. The challenge we face is proving a negative. We need to demonstrate that you didn't do things Marcus did while using your name. In normal identity theft cases, the victim can provide an alibi. They were at work, they were traveling, they have witnesses. But you were deployed overseas with limited communication home. I have military records, I said. Deployment orders, medical files from Walter Reed, witness statements from other Marines. All of which Marcus claims belong to him, Chen replied. Remember, his defense is that he's the real Fletcher Livingston, and you're Marcus trying to steal his identity, retroactively. She pulled out a thick file folder. I've been studying your brother's deception, and I have to admit it's brilliant in its audacity. Look at this timeline. Chen had created a detailed chart showing every major event in Marcus's fraud alongside my actual military service. The 2 timelines were perfectly inverted. When I was wounded in Afghanistan, Marcus was filing disability claims in my name. When I was in surgery at Walter Reed, Marcus was opening credit cards with my information. When I was learning to walk on a prosthetic leg, Marcus was using my veteran status to rent luxury apartments. Your brother didn't just steal your identity, Chen explained. He created a false reality so complete that even federal investigators initially believed his version of events. The question is, how do we prove which reality is true? The legal challenges were staggering. Marcus had been living as Fletcher Livingston for so long that he had employment records, lease agreements, even medical files documenting his supposed recovery from combat injuries. He'd created a paper trail that supported his claim to my identity. The prosecution's biggest hurdle, Chen continued, is that both of you have equal claim to the name Fletcher Livingston from a documentation standpoint. You were born with it, but Marcus has been using it longer and more recently. That's insane, I said. I am Fletcher Livingston. Legally, identity is surprisingly fluid, Chen explained. If I change my name to Susan Smith and live as Susan Smith for 4 years, I have some legal claim to being Susan Smith, even if I wasn't born with that name. Your brother has been Fletcher Livingston in every official capacity for 3 years. She pulled out another document, a motion Marcus's public defender had filed, requesting DNA testing to determine which twin was which. This is their strategy. They're arguing that the twins got confused about their own identities, possibly due to combat trauma or PTSD. The audacity was breathtaking. Marcus was claiming that I was so mentally damaged by military service that I couldn't remember which twin I was. Can they do that? I asked. They can try, Chen said. Military mental health records are sometimes admissible in identity cases. If they can establish that you suffered significant psychological trauma during deployment, they might convince a jury that you're genuinely confused about your own identity. I thought about the nightmares, the phantom pain, The sleepless nights that had plagued me since Afghanistan. All of it was real. All of it was documented in my medical files. And now Marcus was trying to weaponize my suffering against me. So, how do we prove I'm me? Chen smiled for the first time since I'd walked into her office. We use the one thing Marcus can't fake: lived experience. He might have stolen your documents and benefits, but he can't steal your memories. She pulled out a legal pad covered in notes. I've been interviewing your former squad mates, medical personnel from Walter Reed, even some of the Afghan interpreters you worked with. Their testimonies create a picture of Fletcher Livingston that Marcus could never replicate. What do you mean? Marcus might know the facts of your military service from reading your files, but he doesn't know the details. He doesn't know that you always carried photos of your parents in your left breast pocket, or that you had a habit of humming Johnny Cash songs during long patrols. He doesn't know that you cried when you had to put down a wounded military dog, or that you gave your Purple Heart medal to Private Kowalski's mother at his funeral. I stared at her. How do you know about Kowalski's funeral? Because I called his mother, Chen said. She remembers you very clearly. She also remembers that Marcus showed up at the funeral, claiming to be Fletcher Livingston's twin brother, but didn't know any of the details about how her son died, or why you felt responsible for saving him. The pieces started clicking together. Marcus had attended Kowalski's funeral as my supposed twin brother, probably gathering information he could use to support his false identity. But he'd made mistakes, small ones, that only someone who'd actually served with Kowalski would notice. Mrs. Kowalski is willing to testify, Chen continued. So are 6 other Marines from your unit, 2 doctors from Walter Reed, and the Afghan interpreter who worked with your squad for 8 months. They all know Fletcher Livingston personally, and they all agree that you're him. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something like hope. There's more, Chen said. I've been investigating Marcus's activities during the time he claims to have been deployed. Turns out, he was sloppy about covering his tracks domestically. He used local Atlanta businesses, appeared in social media photos, even got a parking ticket downtown while supposedly serving overseas. She pulled out a traffic citation dated 6 months into my second deployment. Marcus received this ticket while claiming to be Fletcher Livingston deployed in Afghanistan. Either he was the first Marine in history to get a parking ticket in Georgia while stationed in Kandahar, or he's lying about his military service. The evidence was building, but Chen warned me the legal process would be lengthy and expensive. Identity theft cases involving family members often took years to resolve, especially when the defendant maintained their innocence and had access to extensive documentation. Marcus isn't going to give up easily, Chen said. He's invested 3 years building this false identity. He's got nowhere to go if he admits the truth. Prison time for identity theft, fraud, and draft evasion. He's going to fight this with everything he has. Good, I said. I've been fighting for 3 years to rebuild my life. I'm not about to stop now. Chen closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Fletcher, I need you to understand something. This case isn't just about clearing your name or recovering your money. If we win, we're setting precedent for how identity theft between family members is prosecuted. If we lose, we're essentially telling criminals that stealing from your relatives is a viable legal strategy. I thought about all the other veterans who might face similar betrayals, all the families that might be torn apart by greed and cowardice disguised as desperation. Then we don't lose, I said. Chen smiled and extended her hand. Welcome to the fight of your life, Marine. As I shook her hand, I realized this was bigger than just my case. This was about justice, accountability, and the principle that service should be honored, not exploited. Marcus had stolen more than my identity. He'd stolen my faith and family, my trust in the system, and my belief that doing the right thing would be enough. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd bet against a Marine who'd already survived the worst thing that could happen to him. And Marines don't surrender. Marcus's confession letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after his arrest. The envelope bore no return address, but I recognized his handwriting immediately. The same careful script he'd used to forge my signature dozens of times. Inside were 4 pages of his justifications, excuses, and what he probably thought was an apology. The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, carefully crafted to minimize his guilt while maximizing my supposed responsibility for his crimes. Even facing federal charges, Marcus couldn't resist one final attempt to rewrite history. Dear Fletcher, it began. I know you're angry, and I know you think I betrayed you. But before you destroy my life completely, I need you to understand why I did what I did. I almost threw the letter away without reading further. After months of legal proceedings and investigations, I'd heard enough of Marcus's excuses to last several lifetimes. But something made me continue, maybe the same morbid curiosity that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. "You never understood what it was like to be your brother," Marcus wrote. "From the time we were kids, you were the special one, the brave one, the one everyone looked up to. Do you know what it's like to watch your identical twin get all the attention, all the praise, all the love that should have been shared equally?" The victim narrative was vintage Marcus. Everything was someone else's fault, especially mine. According to his version of events, I'd somehow forced him into identity theft by being too successful, too honorable, too willing to serve my country. When you enlisted, everyone acted like you were the only son they had. Mom and Dad couldn't stop talking about Fletcher the Marine, Fletcher the hero, Fletcher the perfect son. I might as well have been invisible. So when I got that draft notice, I panicked. Not because I was afraid to serve, but because I was afraid of failing to live up to the impossible standard you'd set. I had to put the letter down for a moment. Even in his confession, Marcus couldn't admit to cowardice. He was afraid of failing to live up to standards. Not afraid of being shot at or blown up, or having to risk his life for something larger than himself. The identity theft started small. The letter continued. I just needed to buy time to figure out what to do. But then you got hurt, and suddenly everyone was talking about Fletcher, the wounded warrior. Fletcher, the Purple Heart recipient. I realized I could be that person. I could be the brother who mattered. Marcus had devoted an entire page to describing how he'd stepped into my role while I was recovering, as if assuming my identity was some kind of noble sacrifice rather than systematic fraud. He wrote about the comfort he'd provided our parents by pretending to be their wounded son, the way he'd honored my service by living as me. "I know you think I stole your money and your benefits," he wrote, "but I was protecting them. Do you think our parents could have handled the truth? Do you think they could have coped with knowing that both their sons were damaged, one physically, one emotionally? I gave them the version of events they needed to survive. The manipulation was so sophisticated, I almost admired it." Marcus had convinced himself that stealing my identity was actually a form of caregiving, that defrauding the government was a mercy to our parents, that living off my military benefits was somehow protecting my interests. But the most revealing section came near the end of the letter, where Marcus's careful facade finally cracked. "The truth is, Fletcher, I was good at being you. Better than you ever were. I made friends using your name, got jobs using your military record, even dated women who fell in love with Fletcher Livingston. For 3 years, I lived the life you threw away when you decided to play soldier in Afghanistan. And I was happy. There it was. Not remorse, or guilt, or even acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but pride." Marcus was proud of stealing my identity. He believed he'd improved on it, made better use of my name and service record than I ever could have. "I know you want me to go to prison," the letter concluded, "but think about what that means for our family. Think about Mom and Dad losing both their sons, one to war, one to jail. Think about the scandal, the shame, the questions from neighbors and friends. Is your need for revenge worth destroying what's left of the Livingston name?" The final manipulation, making me responsible for the consequences of his choices. If I pursued justice, I'd be the one destroying our family. If I pressed charges, I'd be the vindictive brother seeking revenge rather than the victim seeking accountability. I was still staring at the letter when my phone rang. It was Agent Morrison. "Have you seen your brother's confession?" he asked. "Just finished reading it," I said. "I assume you've got a copy." "We did. Marcus's lawyer sent it to the prosecutor as part of a plea negotiation. They're hoping it demonstrates remorse and acceptance of responsibility." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Did they read the same letter I did? Because this isn't a confession, it's a justification. Marcus doesn't think he did anything wrong." "That's exactly what the prosecutor said," Morrison replied. "The letter actually strengthens our case. It shows premeditation, sophisticated planning, and complete lack of genuine remorse. A federal judge is going to see this as evidence that Marcus would do it again if given the opportunity." I walked to my window and looked out at the parking lot of my modest apartment complex, the best I could afford after Marcus had destroyed my credit and stolen my benefits. "What happens next?" "Marcus's lawyer is pushing for a plea deal," Morrison said. "Reduced charges in exchange for full restitution and a guilty plea. The prosecutor wants to know how you feel about that." I thought about the 3 years I'd spent rebuilding my life while Marcus lived comfortably on my stolen benefits. I thought about the humiliation of being arrested at my own Purple Heart ceremony. I thought about my parents choosing to protect their guilty son, instead of supporting their innocent one. Agent Morrison, I said, I want Marcus to face the full consequences of his choices. Every charge, every count, every possible penalty. He had 3 years to make this right, and instead he doubled down on his lies. That's what I thought you'd say, Morrison replied. The trial is scheduled for next month. Are you ready? I looked at Marcus's confession letter one more time, then carefully folded it and put it in my file with all the other evidence of his betrayal. I'd been ready for 3 years. That afternoon, I sat down and wrote my own letter, not to Marcus, but to myself. A reminder of who I was before this nightmare began, and who I was determined to be when it ended. My name is Fletcher Marcus Livingston, I wrote. I am a United States Marine. I served my country with honor in Afghanistan. I lost my leg saving a fellow Marine's life. I earned my Purple Heart through sacrifice, not theft. And I will not let my brother's cowardice define the rest of my story. Some bridges can't be rebuilt once they're burned. Some trust can't be restored once it's shattered. Marcus had made his choice 3 years ago when he decided my identity was worth more than our brotherhood. Now it was time for him to live with the consequences. My VFW membership card arrived the same week Marcus's confession letter did, but it felt like a message from a different universe. While my own family had chosen to protect my brother's lies, a group of strangers who'd never met me were ready to fight for my honor. The card itself was simple, just my name, member number, and the VFW logo, but it represented something I'd lost when my own family betrayed me. Belonging. I'd first walked into VFW Post 1247, 3 weeks after my arrest, desperate and alone, carrying a folder full of documents that proved my military service. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. If my own parents could doubt my identity, why would strangers trust my word? The post commander was a Vietnam veteran named Earl Rodriguez, a man whose lined face and steady eyes spoke of battles fought and survived. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally nodding as I explained Marcus's deception and its devastating impact on my life. When I finished, Earl was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked to a wall covered with photographs of deceased members, and pointed to a young man in dress blues. That's my son Miguel, he said, killed by an IED in Iraq in 2005. He was 22 years old, about to come home and marry his high school sweetheart. I didn't understand the connection until Earl continued. 3 months after Miguel died, some piece of garbage tried to claim he was Miguel's brother so he could collect survivor benefits, showed up at the VA with fake documents, spun a sob story about being the forgotten family member who deserved compensation for his loss. Earl's jaw tightened with old anger. You know what we did to that son of a bitch? We made sure everyone knew exactly what kind of scum steals from fallen soldiers. We made sure he went to prison, and we made sure Miguel's real family got the support they needed. He turned back to me. Fletcher, I've been listening to veteran stories for 40 years. I've heard every lie, every excuse, every manipulation in the book. You know what I haven't heard? I haven't heard the kind of specific, detailed, painful truth you just told me. Nobody fakes the way you described learning to walk on a prosthetic. Nobody makes up the nightmares about leaving Kowalski behind. That was the moment I understood that the veteran community operates on a different code than civilian families. Among veterans, service isn't just about documents and records, it's about shared experience, mutual recognition, and the understanding that comes from facing similar trials. Within a week, word had spread through the local veteran network. My story reached other VFW posts, American Legion chapters, and Marine Corps League detachments across 3 states. The response was swift and overwhelming. Sergeant Major Williams, my old squad leader from Afghanistan, called me from North Carolina. Fletcher, what do you need? Money, witnesses, character references. You say the word, and I'll have 50 Marines on the next plane to testify for you. The Afghan interpreter who'd worked with our unit tracked me down through military channels. Mr. Fletcher, he said in heavily accented English, I hear someone trying to steal your honor. This cannot happen. You saved my life 3 times in Kandahar. I tell any judge, any lawyer, any person who will listen. Even veterans I'd never met began reaching out. The Purple Heart recipient from the Gulf War sent me a check for $500 with a note. Nobody steals from a brother on my watch. A Viet Marine drove for hours just to shake my hand and offer to testify about my character. The contrast with my family's response was stark and painful. While my parents questioned my identity and made excuses for Marcus's crimes, total strangers, were ready to mortgage their homes to fund my legal defense, while my blood relatives chose loyalty to a thief over justice for his victim. People who'd never met me were organizing fundraisers and character witness campaigns. Earl Rodriguez explained it best during one of our conversations at the Post. Fletcher, your family loves Marcus more than they love what's right. But veterans love what's right more than we love comfort. We've all bled for principles that matter more than personal loyalty. The veteran community's support extended beyond moral encouragement. They organized practical help in ways my family never had. Vietnam vets taught me how to navigate VA bureaucracy. Iraq veterans shared their experiences with PTSD and phantom pain. Afghanistan veterans provided character references and witness statements. Most importantly, they reminded me daily that my service had meaning, that my sacrifice was honored, and that Marcus's theft was an affront to every person who'd worn the uniform. What your brother did, Earl told me one evening as we watched the sunset from the Post's back porch. He didn't just steal from you, he stole from every veteran who earned their benefits through blood and sweat. He made a mockery of every Purple Heart, every combat action ribbon, every sacrifice made by American service members. That perspective helped me understand why the veteran community had rallied so quickly to my cause. This wasn't just about one Marine's identity, it was about protecting the integrity of military service itself. Marcus's crime was an attack on the entire system of honor and recognition that gives meaning to military sacrifice. The night before Marcus's trial began, the local VFW hosted a dinner in my honor. 40 veterans from 5 different conflicts gathered to show their support. Earl presented me with a framed certificate declaring me Marine of the Year for my courage in fighting back against family betrayal. Fletcher, he said in his brief speech, you've shown us what it means to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. You've reminded us that honor isn't just about what we do in uniform, it's about how we live our entire lives. As I looked around the room at these men and women who'd chosen to stand with me, I realized that Marcus's greatest theft wasn't my money, or my benefits, or even my identity. It was the family bond that should have been unbreakable, the trust that should have been automatic, the loyalty that should have been unconditional. But he'd also given me something unexpected. Proof that family isn't just about blood and birth certificates. Sometimes family is about shared values, mutual respect, and the willingness to fight for each other when everything goes wrong. The veterans in that room understood something my biological family never had, that defending truth and justice matters more than protecting comfortable lies, that supporting the victim matters more than enabling the perpetrator, that some principles are worth fighting for, even when the cost is personal and painful. My VFW membership card sits in my wallet next to that old Christmas photo of my biological family. Both represent belonging, but only one represents the kind of belonging that survives when everything else falls apart. The brotherhood I found among veterans taught me that identity isn't just about your name, or your documents, or your shared DNA. Real identity comes from your choices, your principles, and your willingness to stand up for what's right even when it costs you everything. Marcus could steal my name, but he couldn't steal the respect I'd earned from the people who understood what that name really meant. The newspaper headline that changed everything was 5 words long: War Hero Framed by Twin Brother. It ran on the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution 3 days before Marcus's trial, accompanied by a photo of me in dress blues, next to my mugshot from the Purple Heart ceremony arrest. I never wanted to be a public figure. After 3 years of legal battles fought in courtrooms and federal offices, I'd hoped to resolve this quietly and rebuild my life away from public scrutiny. But Marcus's case had attracted the attention of investigative journalist Sarah Martinez, who'd been following military identity theft cases for the past year. Your story represents something bigger, Martinez explained when she first contacted me. Veterans coming home to discover their families have stolen their benefits, their identities, even their service records. You're not the only one, Fletcher, but you might be the first one willing to fight back publicly. I was reluctant to talk to any reporter. The legal proceedings were ongoing, and Rebecca Chen had warned me about saying anything that might compromise the case. But Martinez was persistent. And when she showed me documentation of 6 other similar cases across the country, I realized this was about more than just my personal situation. If you speak out, Martinez said, you might prevent this from happening to other veterans. Your case could change how identity theft between family members is prosecuted. The article ran on a Sunday morning and immediately went viral. By noon, my phone was ringing every few minutes. Reporters, producers, veterans advocacy groups, and complete strangers who wanted to offer support. The story had touched a nerve I hadn't expected. The veteran community response was immediate and overwhelming. #JusticeForFletcher began trending on social media within hours. Veterans from across the country shared their own stories of family betrayal, financial theft, and identity fraud. Some had been stolen from by siblings, others by parents or spouses, but all shared the common experience of having their service exploited by people they trusted. "Your courage is inspiring," read one message from a Navy veteran in California. "My ex-wife stole my disability benefits for 2 years while I was deployed. I never reported it because I was ashamed. Seeing you fight back gives me hope." A Marine from Texas wrote, "My brother used my name to avoid a DUI. Small compared to your case. But seeing you stand up to family makes me realize I don't have to protect people who won't protect me." The media attention brought unexpected allies. Veterans advocacy organizations reached out to offer legal support. Military law firms contacted Rebecca Chen about taking on similar cases pro bono. Congressional representatives began asking questions about how the VA and military justice systems handle family identity theft. But the media attention also brought scrutiny I wasn't prepared for. Reporters began digging into every aspect of my life and Marcus's defense strategy. Some questioned whether twin identity confusion might be a legitimate psychological phenomenon. Others suggested that family disputes should be resolved privately, rather than in federal court. Their worst coverage came from a cable news pundit, who argued that I was destroying my own family for money. He claimed that pressing charges against Marcus was vindictive, and that real heroes forgive their families. The segment painted me as a greedy veteran, seeking revenge, rather than a crime victim seeking justice. How do you respond to critics who say you should forgive your brother and move on? A reporter asked during an impromptu interview outside the courthouse. I'd ask those critics if they'd say the same thing if Marcus had robbed a bank. I replied, identity theft is a federal crime. Military benefit fraud is a federal crime. The fact that we share DNA doesn't change the fact that he committed multiple felonies over 3 years. The media circus reached its peak when Marcus's defense team decided to fight back through public relations. They arranged interviews where Marcus portrayed himself as the real victim, confused veteran struggling with PTSD who'd been wrongly accused by his vindictive brother. In a particularly galling television appearance, Marcus actually wore a Purple Heart pin while claiming that I was the one who'd stolen his identity. He spoke movingly about his service in Afghanistan and the trauma of being betrayed by family. The interviewer didn't fact-check his claims or asked for documentation of his military service. Watching that interview was surreal. Rebecca Chen told me afterward, "Your brother is sitting on national television wearing your medal, claiming credit for your service, while portraying you as the criminal. The audacity is breathtaking. The false media narrative Marcus created forced me to become more public than I'd wanted. I began accepting interview requests, not to seek attention, but to counter his lies with documented truth. Every television appearance required bringing military records, medical files, and witness statements to prove I was who I claimed to be. The most powerful media moment came during a live interview, when a reporter asked me to prove my military service. I rolled up my pant leg and showed my prosthetic, then described in detail the eye blast that took my leg and the 47 minutes I spent keeping Corporal Williams alive while waiting for medevac. "Mr. Livingston," the reporter said, quietly, "that level of detail can't be faked." "No," I agreed, "it can't. And that's how you tell the difference between someone who served and someone who stole a uniform." The interview clip was shared millions of times. Veterans began posting their own videos showing scars, prosthetics, and medical devices as proof of their service. The hashtag #ProveYourService became a rallying cry for authentic veterans fighting back against stolen valor and identity theft. But the most meaningful media coverage came from a small veterans magazine that ran a simple headline, "Fletcher Livingston, Marine." The article didn't focus on the legal drama or family betrayal. Instead, it detailed my actual military service, the lives saved, the missions completed, the sacrifices made. It reminded readers that behind all the courtroom drama was a real veteran who'd earned his honors through blood and commitment. "Thank you for not letting them forget what this is really about," the magazine's editor told me. "It's not about twin confusion or family disputes. It's about a Marine who served his country with honor and deserves to have that service respected." As Marcus's trial approached, the media attention intensified. Camera crews gathered outside the courthouse. Reporters positioned themselves to Catch comments from witnesses. Veterans groups organized demonstrations of support. The publicity was overwhelming and sometimes uncomfortable. But it served an important purpose. Marcus's crime couldn't be dismissed as a private family matter when the entire country was watching. The case had become a symbol of military honor versus family corruption, service versus selfishness, truth versus manipulation. Standing outside the courthouse on the morning of opening statements, surrounded by cameras and reporters and veterans who'd traveled hundreds of miles to show support, I realized that Marcus's theft had created something he never intended. A public reckoning with the idea that family loyalty trumps justice. "Are you ready for this, Fletcher?" a reporter called out. I looked at the veterans holding signs supporting me, at the media crews documenting every moment, at the courthouse, where truth would finally be tested against lies. "I've been ready for 3 years," I said. "Let's get this done." The trial would determine Marcus's legal fate, but the media coverage had already accomplished something equally important. It had shown the world that some things matter more than family harmony. Truth matters. Justice matters. And military service deserves to be honored, not stolen. The court summons that finally brought Marcus to justice was delivered to an address I'd never seen before, a luxury high-rise apartment in downtown Atlanta that he'd rented using my name and veteran housing assistance, even facing federal charges. Marcus had continued living off my stolen identity right up until the moment marshals knocked on his door. The arrest came at 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning. According to the police report, Marcus answered the door wearing silk pajamas and a Rolex watch, both purchased with credit cards he'd opened using my information. He'd been living like a trust fund kid on my military benefits, and his lifestyle choices became evidence of his guilt. "Mr. Livingston," the lead marshal had said, "you're under arrest for identity theft, fraud, and violation of the Military Selective Service Act." Marcus's response, recorded by bodycam footage that would later be played in court, was telling. "You've got the wrong Livingston. My brother is the one you want." Even with handcuffs being applied, Marcus couldn't bring himself to drop the act. He was still claiming to be Fletcher Livingston, still insisting that I was Marcus the draft evader. His commitment to the lie was absolute, even when it no longer served any purpose. The evidence against him had been mounting for months. Agent Morrison's investigation had uncovered a digital trail that told the complete story of Marcus's deception. Browser histories showing searches for how to forge military documents and twin identity theft legal precedents. Bank records proving he'd been physically present in Atlanta while claiming to serve overseas. Employment records from jobs he'd obtained using my veteran status. But the most damning evidence came from Marcus himself. During his 3 years as me, Marcus had been careless about maintaining his false identity. He'd created social media profiles where he bragged about his military service, but made factual errors that only someone who'd never served would make. He'd claimed to have been stationed at bases that didn't exist, served in units that weren't deployed when he said they were, and received awards that weren't given during his supposed service period. Rebecca Chen had compiled these mistakes into a comprehensive document that read like a catalog of stolen valor. "Your brother tried to live your life," she told me, "but he didn't understand it well enough to fake it convincingly." The most devastating evidence emerged from Marcus's own apartment. When federal agents executed their search warrant, they found a shrine to my military service photographs of me in uniform that he'd claimed were pictures of himself. Copies of my medical records from Walter Reed. Even my dog tags that he'd somehow obtained and had been wearing around his neck. "It's like he was trying to become you," Agent Morrison told me as we reviewed the search warrant inventory. "This goes beyond identity theft into psychological territory I've never encountered." Marcus had created elaborate backstories about his supposed military service, complete with fictional details about battles he'd never fought and wounds he'd never received. He'd even practiced military bearing and terminology, studying YouTube videos and military manuals to make his impersonation more convincing. But practice couldn't replace lived experience. When confronted with specific questions about military life, Marcus revealed his ignorance in ways that were obvious to anyone who'd actually served. During his initial interrogation, he claimed to have been wounded by an IUD instead of an IED. He couldn't explain basic military rank structures or deployment rotations. He described Afghanistan using details that clearly came from movies rather than personal experience. "The scary part," Morrison said, "is how long he got away with it. Your brother's deception was successful enough to fool civilian authorities for 3 years. It was only when military investigators got involved that the fraud became obvious. Marcus's downfall accelerated when he made the critical mistake of trying to recruit others into his deception. Phone records showed that he'd contacted former classmates and distant relatives, asking them to provide false testimony about his supposed military service. He'd offered money, favors, even romantic relationships in exchange for lying on his behalf. One of these potential accomplices, a former girlfriend named Jennifer Reek, recorded their conversation and turned it over to federal investigators. The recording captured Marcus, offering her $5,000 to testify that she'd visited him in military hospitals and received letters from him during his supposed deployment. "I need you to say you knew Fletcher as a soldier," Marcus could be heard saying on the tape. "Just tell them about the times I talked about Afghanistan, about my injuries, about how hard it was to readjust to civilian life." Jennifer's response was devastating. "Marcus, you never talked about any of that stuff. You never even watched war movies. You said they were too depressing." The recording revealed something crucial about Marcus's psychology. He genuinely seemed to believe his own lies at times. When Jennifer challenged him about specific military details, Marcus became confused and agitated, as if he couldn't quite remember which version of reality was true. "Maybe I forgot some things," he said on the tape. "The trauma, you know. Sometimes I can't remember if something happened to me or Fletcher." But Jennifer wasn't buying it. "Marcus, you never forgot anything. You have the best memory of anyone. I know. You remember what you had for lunch in 3rd grade, but you can't remember your own military service." The conversation ended, with Marcus becoming angry and threatening, revealing the manipulative personality that had driven his 3-year deception. "If you don't help me, Jennifer, they're going to send me to prison. Is that what you want? Do you want to destroy my life over some paperwork confusion?" As the evidence mounted, Marcus's legal position became untenable. His public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in leniency. The case had attracted too much media attention, involved too many federal agencies, and set too important a precedent for identity theft prosecution. Mr. Livingston faces 47 separate federal charges, the prosecutor announced during a pre-trial hearing: identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, benefit fraud, draft evasion, and conspiracy to commit fraud. If convicted on all counts, he could face up to 85 years in federal prison. The number seemed impossible until Rebecca Chen explained the legal reality. "Marcus didn't commit one crime," she told me. "He committed hundreds of individual, fraudulent acts over 3 years. Every stolen check, every false document, every fraudulent application counts as a separate offense." Marcus's final desperate gambit was to claim mental illness. His lawyer argued that twin identity confusion was a recognized psychological condition, that combat trauma had somehow affected both brothers, and that Marcus genuinely believed he was Fletcher Livingston. The psychiatrist hired to evaluate Marcus saw through the performance immediately. Dr. Sarah Patterson, a military mental health specialist, spent 6 hours interviewing Marcus and reviewing his psychological history. "Mr. Livingston shows no signs of identity, confusion, or dissociative disorders," she wrote in her report. "His claims of military trauma are inconsistent with documented symptoms and appear to be fabricated for legal advantage. In my professional opinion, he is malingering, faking mental illness to avoid prosecution." Dr. Patterson's report included devastating details about Marcus's behavior during evaluation. He'd tried to manipulate her assessment by claiming PTSD symptoms he'd clearly researched online. But he couldn't maintain consistency in his false symptoms when questioned by an expert. "When I asked him to describe specific traumatic events," Dr. Patterson wrote, "he provided details that were clearly borrowed from movies, video games, and internet research, rather than personal experience. His supposed flashbacks followed Hollywood patterns rather than clinical reality." The psychological evaluation revealed that Marcus wasn't mentally ill. He was simply a sophisticated liar who'd spent 3 years perfecting his deception. His identity theft wasn't the result of confusion or trauma. It was calculated fraud, designed to avoid responsibility while exploiting his brother's service. As Marcus's trial date approached, his lawyers made one final attempt to avoid conviction. They offered to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a lighter sentence and full restitution. They painted Marcus as a desperate young man who'd made a terrible mistake and was ready to make amends. But the prosecutor's response was swift and final. Mr. Livingston had 3 years to make amends. Instead, he doubled down on his fraud, attempted to recruit accomplices, and tried to destroy his brother's life to cover his crimes. The government is prepared to prove every charge at trial. Standing outside the courthouse, after the final pre-trial hearing, watching Marcus being led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Certainty. The legal system that had failed to protect me initially was finally working. Justice wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Marcus had spent 3 years believing he was smarter than the system, more clever than investigators, more convincing than the truth. But fraud, no matter how sophisticated, eventually collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. The man who'd stolen my identity was about to discover that some things can't be faked, some lies can't be sustained, and some crimes can't be explained away with charm and manipulation. His downfall was complete. All that remained was making it official. The witness list that would determine Marcus's fate read like a roll call of everyone who'd touched my life over the past 6 years. 43 names, spanning 2 continents, and representing every aspect of my identity that Marcus had tried to steal. Rebecca Chen spread the list across her conference table like a battle plan. "This is more than a criminal trial," she said. "This is a comprehensive proof of identity case. We're not just proving Marcus committed fraud, we're proving beyond any doubt that you are Fletcher Livingston." The witness preparation process was emotionally exhausting. Each person had to be interviewed, their testimony documented, their credibility verified. Chen was building a case so airtight that even identical DNA couldn't create reasonable doubt about which twin was which. "The prosecution's strategy is elegant," Chen explained. "We're going to present 43 people who knew Fletcher Livingston personally. Each witness will testify about specific interactions, shared experiences, and intimate knowledge that only you could possess. The military witnesses were our strongest assets. Sergeant Major Williams flew in from North Carolina, bringing photographs and documentation from our time in Afghanistan. Corporal Torres, who'd been unconscious during the IED blast, had recovered enough to testify about my medical treatment and the conversations we'd had during rehabilitation. "Fletcher saved my life," Torres told Chen during his preparation session. "I'll never forget the sound of his voice talking me through that medevac ride. Marcus might look like him, but he could never replicate the experience we shared in that moment." The medical witnesses provided scientific proof of my identity. Dr. Elizabeth Harper from Walter Reed brought my complete medical file, including X-rays, surgical notes, and rehabilitation records that documented every stage of my recovery. Mr. Livingston's prosthetic fitting was customized specifically for his anatomy and gait, Dr. Harper explained. "The adjustments we made are unique to his physical measurements and personal preferences. Marcus might be able to fake wearing a prosthetic, but he couldn't replicate the specific adaptations Fletcher has made over 2 years of use." The most emotionally challenging witness preparation involved Mrs. Kowalski, the mother of the soldier I'd tried to save during the attack. She'd driven 12 hours from Ohio to testify, bringing photographs and letters that documented our relationship after her son's death. "Fletcher came to Danny's funeral," she told Chen, tears in her eyes. "He blamed himself for not saving my boy, even though the doctors said Danny died from internal injuries that couldn't have been treated in the field. Fletcher gave me his Purple Heart medal, said Danny earned it more than he did." Mrs. Kowalski's testimony would be devastating. To Marcus's case, he'd attended the funeral claiming to be Fletcher's twin brother, but he'd made mistakes that only she would notice, calling her son David instead of Danny, claiming Fletcher had spoken about events that never happened, showing no knowledge of the specific circumstances of her son's death. Marcus knew Fletcher had attended a fallen soldier's funeral, Chen explained, but he didn't know the details well enough to impersonate someone who'd actually been there. The civilian witnesses were equally important. My landlord from before deployment testified about lease agreements and security deposits. My physical therapist documented the progression of my prosthetic fitting and gait training. Even my barber provided testimony about conversations we'd had during my post-deployment haircuts. "The beauty of authentic lived experience," Chen said, "is that it creates hundreds of small, verifiable details that can't be researched or faked. Marcus might know the big facts about Fletcher's military service, but he doesn't know that Fletcher always tips 25%, or that he has a scar on his left shoulder from a childhood bicycle accident." The most crucial witness was Ahmed Rashid, the Afghan interpreter who'd worked with our unit for 8 months. He'd risked his life to travel to the United States to testify, bringing his own documentation and photographs from our shared deployment. "Mr. Fletcher, he saved my life 3 times. Ahmad told Chen in his careful English. Once from IED, once from sniper, once from infection, when no medicine available. I know his voice, his face, his heart. Other man, he may look same, but he is not same inside. Ahmad's testimony would counter any defense arguments about twin confusion or mistaken identity. He'd worked closely with me for months under combat conditions, sharing experiences that created bonds impossible to fake or replicate. Preparing for my own testimony was the most difficult part of the process. Chen needed me to recount 3 years of my life in precise detail, documenting every moment that proved I was Fletcher Livingston, while Marcus was stealing my identity. You'll be on the witness stand for at least 2 days, Chen warned. The defense will try to shake your confidence, create doubt about your memories, even suggest that you're the one who's confused about your identity. We practiced for hours, with Chen playing the role of Marcus's aggressive defense attorney. She challenged every detail of my military service, questioned my medical records, even suggested that combat trauma had affected my memory and judgment. Remember, she coached, you're not just testifying about what happened to you. You're testifying about who you are. Every answer needs to reflect a lived experience that Marcus could never possess. The emotional preparation was as important as the legal preparation. Chen arranged for me to meet with a counselor who specialized in identity theft trauma condition I hadn't realized existed until I started experiencing it. Identity theft between family members creates unique psychological damage, the counselor explained. It's not just about money or creditites, about having your very existence questioned by people who are supposed to love and protect you. The sessions helped me understand why this case felt different from ordinary criminal prosecution. Marcus hadn't just stolen my money or documents, he'd stolen my sense of self, my place in my family, my confidence in my own reality. As the trial date approached, Chen arranged a final strategy session with all our key witnesses, seeing them gathered in one room: Marines, doctors, interpreters, neighbors. Even Mrs. Kowalski drove home the scope of the life Marcus had tried to appropriate. Ladies and gentlemen, Chen addressed the group. You represent 6 years of Fletcher Livingston's authentic lived experience. Marcus spent 3 years studying Fletcher's life from the outside. But you've shared moments with him that can't be faked or researched. Looking around that room, I realized something profound. Identity isn't just about documents or DNA or even shared appearance. Real identity is built through relationships, experiences, and the thousands of small interactions that create a unique human story. Marcus might have stolen my name and benefits, but he couldn't steal the relationships that made me who I was. These witnesses weren't just going to prove my legal identity, they were going to prove my human identity. Are you ready for this, Fletcher? Chen asked as the session ended. I looked at the faces of people who'd believed in me when my own family wouldn't, who'd traveled hundreds of miles to stand up for truth, who'd risked their time and reputation to ensure justice was served. We're all ready, I said. Let's go prove who I really am. The court transcript that documented Marcus's conviction runs 847 pages and represents 3 weeks of testimony that systematically dismantled 3 years of lies. Page 1 shows his confident plea of not guilty to all charges. Page 847 shows his sentencing to 12 years in federal prison, followed by deportation, a detail I'd forgotten about until the judge mentioned that Marcus had never actually been a citizen, having been born 23 minutes before me in a Canadian hospital during a family vacation. The trial began on a Monday morning in late September. Federal District Judge Maria Santos presided over a courtroom packed with veterans, family members, media representatives, and law students studying the case as a precedent for identity theft prosecution. Marcus entered wearing a Navy suit that made him look like a clean-cut veteran, his hair cut in a military style he'd never worn while actually avoiding military service, even facing federal charges. He was still playing the role of Fletcher Livingston. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Park stood before the jury and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this case comes down to a fundamental question. Which twin served his country with honor in Afghanistan, and which twin stole his brother's identity to avoid military service? By the end of this trial, you'll have no doubt about the answer." Park methodically laid out the timeline of Marcus's deception, using financial records, medical files, and witness testimony to prove that while Fletcher Livingston was bleeding for his country in Afghanistan, Marcus Livingston was living as Fletcher in Atlanta. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Marcus's defense attorney, James Morrison, no relation to Agent Morrison, attempted to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that twin identity confusion was a real psychological phenomenon exacerbated by combat trauma. His opening statement painted both brothers as victims of war who'd become confused about their own identities. "My client isn't a criminal," Morrison argued. "He's a wounded veteran struggling with PTSD and identity issues that stem from the unique psychological bond between identical twins. Fletcher and Marcus have been sharing identities their entire lives. The only difference now is that one brother's trauma has made this natural tendency into a legal issue." The defense strategy collapsed within hours. Sergeant Major Williams took the stand first, bringing decades of military experience and intimate knowledge of my service record. His testimony was precise, detailed, and emotionally powerful. "I served with Fletcher Livingston for 18 months in Afghanistan," Williams said. "I watched him save lives under fire, saw him lose his leg protecting his brothers, and visited him during recovery at Walter Reed. The man sitting at that defense table is not Fletcher Livingston." When Morrison tried to cross-examine Williams about twin confusion, the sergeant major's response was swift and final. "Sir, I've been a Marine for 28 years. I know the difference between a soldier and someone playing dress-up. Dr. Harper's medical testimony provided scientific proof of my identity. She brought x-rays, surgical notes, and prosthetic fittings that were unique to my anatomy and injury pattern. Mr. Fletcher Livingston's prosthetic device was custom manufactured based on precise measurements of his residual limb," Dr. Harper explained. "The adjustments we made are specific to his gait pattern, muscle memory, and personal preferences developed over 2 years of rehabilitation." When the prosecutor asked her to examine Marcus in open court, the results were conclusive. Marcus couldn't demonstrate familiarity with the prosthetic device, didn't know how to attach or adjust it, and showed no evidence of the muscle memory and adaptation that comes from 2 years of daily use. "In my medical opinion," Dr. Harper concluded, "the defendant has never worn this prosthetic device before today." Ahmad Rashid's testimony provided the most emotional moment of the trial. Speaking through an interpreter, he described months of shared combat experience with meticulous detail. "Mr. Fletcher, he'd teach me American jokes," Ahmad said, tears in his eyes. "He'd show me pictures of his family, tell me about a place called Georgia. When I am wounded by mortar, he'd carry me to helicopter. I know his voice, his hands, his heart. This man," he pointed at Marcus, "he is stranger to me." Marcus's defense team tried to challenge Ahmad's testimony by suggesting that combat stress might have affected his memory. The cross-examination backfired spectacularly when Ahmad recounted specific conversations he'd had with me about my childhood, my dreams, and my reasons for serving. "Fletcher tell me he have twin brother, who is afraid of war," Ahmad said quietly. "He is sad about this brother, worry about family. He say twin brother is lost, cannot find courage. Now I understand what he mean." Mrs. Kowalski's testimony destroyed any remaining credibility Marcus might have had. She described his appearance at her son's funeral, his obvious lack of knowledge about the circumstances of Danny's death, and his confusion about basic facts that any actual witness would remember. "He called my boy David," she said, her voice breaking. "Danny's name was on his uniform, on his coffin, in every conversation. But this man called him David and didn't understand why I corrected him." The prosecution's case built systematically over 2 weeks, with 43 witnesses, providing testimony that created an unshakable foundation of proof. Marcus might look like Fletcher Livingston, but he couldn't replicate the lived experience that made Fletcher unique. But Marcus finally took the stand in his own defense. His testimony was a masterclass in desperation. He maintained his claim that he was the real Fletcher, but his answers revealed knowledge gaps that were impossible to explain. He couldn't describe the layout of our base in Afghanistan. He didn't know the names of soldiers in our unit. He couldn't explain specific medical procedures he'd supposedly undergone. When asked about his prosthetic leg, he gave answers that contradicted established medical facts. The most damaging moment came when Park asked Marcus to describe the eyed blast that had supposedly cost him his leg. "It was loud," Marcus said hesitantly. "Very loud. And then everything went dark." "Can you describe the location where this occurred?" "It was in Afghanistan, near Kandahar. Can you be more specific?" Marcus looked confused, as if he'd never considered that someone who'd actually experienced a traumatic event would remember specific details. His vague, generic answers contrasted sharply with my precise, painful testimony about the same incident. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, The foreman read guilty 47 times, once for each federal charge Marcus faced. Judge Santos's sentencing statement was as harsh as it was eloquent. "Mr. Marcus Livingston," she said, "you have committed one of the most comprehensive identity thefts in federal history. You didn't just steal your brother's name or benefits, you stole his service, his sacrifice, and his honor. You turned his heroism into your profit and his pain into your gain." She continued, "This court has heard testimony from 43 witnesses who knew Fletcher Livingston personally. Their combined testimony creates an unshakable proof of identity that your deception could never overcome. You are not a victim of war, trauma, or twin confusion. You are a criminal who exploited your brother's service for personal gain." The sentence was 12 years in federal prison, followed by deportation to Canada. Marcus would also pay full restitution of $327,000 plus interest and penalties, and would be permanently barred from receiving any federal benefits. As the marshals led Marcus away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one final time. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes that might have been regret, not for his crimes, but for getting caught. Standing in that courtroom, surrounded by the people who'd fought for my vindication, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years: complete validation. The legal system had worked, justice had been served, and my identity had been restored beyond any shadow of doubt. The trial was over, but the real work of rebuilding my life was just beginning. At least now, I knew who I was again. The corrected military service record arrived 6 weeks after Marcus's conviction, delivered by certified mail in an official Department of Defense envelope. 23 pages of documentation that finally, officially, confirmed what I'd always known. I am Fletcher Marcus Livingston, United States Marine Corps, honorably discharged, Purple Heart recipient, combat action ribbon holder. Seeing my name properly listed next to my actual service history felt like receiving my identity back from a 3-year kidnapping. Every award, every deployment, every day of service was correctly attributed to me. The draft evasion flags had been removed. The false entries created by Marcus's deception had been purged from the system, but correcting the paperwork was easier than correcting the damage. Agent Morrison helped me navigate the bureaucratic maze of identity restoration. The process required visits to 7 different federal agencies, each with its own requirements for proving I was who I claimed to be, despite 3 years of systematic identity theft. The good news, Morrison explained during one of our meetings, is that Marcus's conviction eliminates most questions about your identity. The bad news is that federal bureaucracy moves slowly, and each agency has to process your case individually. The Social Security Administration was first. They'd flagged my Social Security number as compromised due to Marcus's fraudulent use, which meant I needed new documentation to prove I was the legitimate holder. The irony wasn't lost on my head to prove my identity, to reclaim my own Social Security number. The Department of Veterans Affairs required separate hearings to restore my benefits and correct Marcus's fraudulent claims. VA investigators had to review every benefit payment Marcus had received and determine which ones were legitimate compensation for my service versus fraudulent claims based on forged documentation. "Your brother created a complex web of false and legitimate claims," explained VA investigator Patricia Williams. "He filed for real benefits you were entitled to receive, but he also submitted fraudulent applications for conditions you don't have. We need to sort through 3 years of mixed, legitimate, and illegitimate claims." The financial restoration was particularly complicated. Banks and credit agencies had to reverse Marcus's fraudulent accounts while protecting my legitimate credit history. Credit reporting companies had mixed our financial activities so thoroughly that separating Fletcher's legitimate transactions from Marcus's fraudulent ones required forensic accounting. My credit score had been destroyed by Marcus's reckless spending and unpaid debts. Rebuilding it required disputing hundreds of fraudulent entries while documenting my legitimate financial history. The process took 8 months and countless hours of paperwork. The most challenging aspect was emotional rather than bureaucratic. 3 years of having my identity questioned had left psychological scars that didn't heal simply because Marcus was in prison. Identity theft trauma is real, my counselor, Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, explained during one of our sessions. When someone steals your identity, especially a family member, it attacks your fundamental sense of self. You begin to question not just your documentation, but your worth, your reality, your place in the world. The trauma manifested in unexpected ways. I found myself carrying excessive documentation everywhere, afraid that someone would challenge my right to exist. I compulsively checked my credit reports and bank statements, terrified that Marcus had left some hidden fraud that would resurface. I even had nightmares about being arrested again, reliving the humiliation of that Purple Heart ceremony. Recovery from identity theft is similar to recovery from combat trauma, Dr. Rodriguez observed. Both involve having your fundamental assumptions about safety and trust shattered by events beyond your control. The veteran community continued to provide crucial support during the restoration process. Earl Rodriguez and the VFW helped me navigate VA bureaucracy and connected me with other veterans who'd experienced family financial abuse. The hardest part isn't getting your paperwork fixed, Earl told me one evening over coffee. The hardest part is learning to trust the system again, learning to believe that your identity is secure. He was right. Even with court orders and federal agency confirmations, I struggled to believe that my identity was truly mine again. Marcus had been so successful at becoming me that I sometimes felt like I was the imposter trying to reclaim someone else's life. The financial restoration brought both relief and anger. The VA restored $89,000 in stolen benefits, with interest. The military paymaster issued back pay totaling $34,000 for deployment compensation Marcus had diverted. Various federal agencies ordered restitution totaling $327,000, though I knew I'd never see most of it since Marcus had spent everything. More important than money was the restoration of my official status. My veteran ID card was reissued with correct information. My Purple Heart citation was reprocessed with proper documentation. My disability rating was corrected to reflect my actual injuries, rather than the fictional conditions Marcus had claimed. The most meaningful restoration came from Walter Reed Medical Center, where I'd undergone my initial recovery. Dr. Harper arranged for my medical records to be comprehensively reviewed and corrected, removing any confusion created by Marcus's fraudulent claims. Your recovery is remarkable, Dr. Harper told me during a follow-up appointment. Not just physically, but emotionally. You've survived combat trauma, identity theft, family betrayal, and a federal trial. Your resilience is extraordinary. 6 months after Marcus's conviction, I reached a milestone I'd thought impossible. I was approved for a VA home loan using my restored credit and confirmed military service. Purchasing my first house felt like reclaiming my future from someone who'd tried to steal it. The 2-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. Completely, legally, undeniably mine. Marcus couldn't touch it, steal it, or claim it belonged to him. I hung my Purple Heart certificate in the living room, next to my Marine Corps discharge papers and a photograph of my squad in Afghanistan. For the first time in 3 years, I could look at symbols of my military service without wondering if someone would challenge my right to display them. The restoration process taught me something important about identity. It's not just about documents and records and official recognition. Real identity comes from the choices you make, the principles you stand for, and the relationships you build based on honesty and mutual respect. Marcus had stolen my name, but he couldn't steal my character. He'd taken my benefits, but he couldn't take my integrity. He'd assumed my identity, but he couldn't replicate the person I'd become through service, sacrifice, and commitment to something larger than myself. Standing in my own living room, looking at proof of my restored identity, I realized that Marcus's greatest failure wasn't getting caught, it was believing that identity could be stolen in the first place. You can't fake the person you become through genuine experience. You can't counterfeit the character that's forged through real trials. And you can't steal the relationships that are built through authentic connection and shared values. I was Fletcher Livingston again, not because the government said so, but because I'd never stopped being him. Even when everyone else forgot who I was, I remembered. And in the end, that was enough. The letter from my parents arrived 18 months after Marcus's conviction, delivered to my new address through channels I couldn't quite figure out, since I'd never told them where I lived. The envelope was addressed in my mother's careful handwriting, and inside were 3 pages that represented their first attempt at acknowledging the magnitude of what had happened to our family. Dear Fletcher, it began, and I had to stop reading for a moment. After 3 years of questions about my identity, seeing my own name written in my mother's handwriting felt like a small miracle. We know this letter is long overdue, and we know it can't undo the pain we've caused you. We've spent the past 1.5 years in counseling, trying to understand how we failed you so completely when you needed us most. I set the letter down and made coffee before continuing. The counseling part surprised me. My parents had always been skeptical of therapy, viewing it as something for people who couldn't handle their problems independently. Dr. Martinez has helped us understand that our response to Marcus's crimes was itself a kind of betrayal. We protected the son who'd committed crimes instead of supporting the son who'd been victimized. We enabled Marcus's deception because it was easier than confronting the truth about his character and our failures as parents. The admission was more honest than anything they'd said during the 3 years of legal proceedings. Throughout Marcus's trial, they'd maintained that the situation was a family misunderstanding that should have been resolved privately rather than through federal prosecution. We realize now that we've been making excuses for Marcus since he was a child. When he forged report cards, we blamed the school system. When he stole money from your college fund, we called it borrowing between brothers. When he avoided military service by stealing your identity, we convinced ourselves it was desperation rather than calculated fraud. Reading their words, I felt a complex mix of validation and sadness. They were finally acknowledging patterns I'd seen for years, but had been gaslit into questioning. Marcus's identity theft hadn't been an isolated incident. Cliff was the culmination of a lifetime of manipulation that my parents had enabled through denial and favoritism. The hardest truth we've had to face is that we knew Marcus was lying about his military service from the beginning. The documents he showed us were obviously forged. The stories he told about his deployment didn't match your actual experiences. But we wanted to believe that both our sons were heroes, rather than confront the reality that one was a criminal. This admission hit hardest. My parents hadn't been fooled by Marcus's deception. They'd been complicit in it. They'd chosen to believe convenient lies rather than difficult truths, even when those lies destroyed their other son's life. Dr. Martinez has helped us understand that our favoritism toward Marcus was rooted in our own failures and insecurities. Marcus needed us more than you did, so protecting him made us feel useful. You were always independent and strong, so we took your resilience for granted. We failed to recognize that strength doesn't mean someone doesn't need support. The psychological insight was accurate but painful. I'd spent my entire childhood being the easy son, the one who didn't create problems or demand attention. My parents had interpreted my self-reliance as proof that I didn't need them, while Marcus's constant crises had made him seem vulnerable and worthy of protection. We know we can't undo the damage we've caused to your life and your faith in family. We know that saying we're sorry isn't enough to repair 3 years of betrayal and abandonment. But we wanted you to know that we finally understand the magnitude of what we did to you. The letter continued with specific acknowledgments of their failures: not visiting me in the hospital after my injury, not supporting me during the legal proceedings, not believing my version of events even when presented with overwhelming evidence, and continuing to protect Marcus even after his conviction. We've established a trust fund in your name, using money from the sale of Marcus's belongings and some of our own savings. It's not enough to compensate for what you lost, but it's our attempt to provide practical support along with our apologies. The financial gesture was unexpected, but appreciated. Money couldn't repair our relationship, but it demonstrated genuine effort to make amends rather than just expressing regret. We understand if you can't forgive us. We understand if you never want to see us again. We've lost one son to prison and another son to our own failures. That's a consequence we'll have to live with for the rest of our lives. The letter ended with an invitation that I'd been both hoping for and dreading. If you're ever willing to talk to us, we'd like to try to rebuild some kind of relationship with our son. Not the relationship we had before, because that was built on dysfunction and denial, but something honest and healthy. I set the letter aside and spent 3 days thinking about their offer. The anger I'd carried for 3 years hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into something more complex. I was still furious about their betrayal, but I also felt sorry for people who'd spent their entire lives enabling destruction while calling it love. Dr. Rodriguez helped me process my conflicted feelings during our next session. Forgiveness isn't about excusing their behavior, she explained. It's about deciding whether you want to carry their failures for the rest of your life. I decided to meet with them, but on my terms. The reunion took place at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant halfway between their house and mine. I brought Rebecca Chen as moral support and witness, which probably seemed excessive, but felt necessary for my emotional safety. My parents looked older than I remembered, worn down by guilt and the consequences of their choices. Mom cried when she saw me, but she didn't try to hug me or pretend everything was normal. Dad shook my hand formally, like he was meeting me for the first time. "Thank you for agreeing to see us," Mom said quietly. "We weren't sure you would." I wasn't sure I would either, I admitted. The conversation was awkward but honest. They asked about my recovery. my new job helping other veterans navigate disability claims, and my small house that represented rebuilt independence. I answered their questions, but didn't volunteer much additional information. Trust would have to be earned gradually. We know we can't be your parents the way we were before, Dad said. That relationship was broken by our failures, but we'd like to try to be people you can respect, even if you can't love us. The distinction was important. They weren't asking for forgiveness or immediate reconciliation. They were asking for the opportunity to prove they'd learned from their mistakes. I'm willing to try, I said finally. But I need you to understand that this is starting over, not picking up where we left off. You'll have to earn my trust the same way strangers would. Mom nodded through fresh tears. We understand. We're grateful for the chance. The rebuilding process has been slow and sometimes frustrating. We have dinner once a month, always in public places, always with clear boundaries about topics and expectations. They've attended some of my veteran advocacy events, quietly supporting my work without trying to claim credit for my recovery. The relationship we're building isn't the warm, unconditional family bond I grew up believing we had. It's more careful, more honest, and more fragile. But it's also more real than what came before. They've made genuine efforts to understand the impact of their choices. Mom volunteers at a veteran support organization, working with families of deployed soldiers. Dad has educated himself about identity theft and military benefits, fraud, becoming an advocate for stronger protections for service members. We can't change what we did to you, Mom told me during one of our monthly dinners. But we can try to prevent it from happening to other families. Their advocacy work doesn't absolve them of their failures, but it demonstrates genuine commitment to making amends through action rather than just words. The most significant breakthrough came when they attended one of my speaking events about family identity theft. I'd been invited to address a conference of veterans advocates, sharing my experience to help others recognize and prevent similar crimes. Watching my parents sit in the audience, as I described their betrayal, was painful for all of us, but afterward, Mom approached me with something approaching pride. I'm proud of you, she said simply. Not just for surviving what happened, but for turning it into something that helps other people. That's the son we raised, even if we forgot it for a while. The comment encapsulated the complexity of our rebuilt relationship. They were acknowledging both their failures and my strength, taking neither full credit nor complete blame for who I'd become. The question of Marcus remains difficult. My parents visit him in federal prison occasionally, maintaining minimal contact, out of obligation rather than affection. They've made it clear that supporting Marcus doesn't mean excusing his crimes or minimizing my victimization. Marcus will always be our son, Dad explained during one conversation, but he's not our priority anymore. You're the son who deserves our support and attention. The shift in their loyalty is something I'm still processing. Part of me appreciates their newfound commitment to justice and accountability. Another part of me wonders if their support is genuine or just another form of the favoritism that contributed to this mess in the first place. Dr. Rodriguez helps me navigate these complicated feelings. Your parents are trying to rebuild a relationship with you while processing their own guilt and grief, she observes. It's natural for that process to feel inconsistent and sometimes inadequate. The trust fund they established has grown to nearly $50,000 through their ongoing contributions. They add money quarterly and send detailed statements showing exactly how the funds are invested and managed. The transparency is their attempt to demonstrate financial accountability after years of enabling Marcus's theft. I haven't touched the money yet. It sits there as a symbol of their commitment to making amends, but also as a reminder of what money can and can't repair. Financial restitution doesn't restore lost years or heal emotional wounds, but it does represent genuine effort to acknowledge the magnitude of their failures. The most healing moments have come when they've supported my advocacy work without trying to insert themselves into my story. They attend events where I speak about identity theft and military fraud, sitting quietly in the audience, never claiming credit for my recovery or minimizing their role in my trauma. We're proud of the man you've become, despite our failures, Mom told me recently, not because of anything we did. That distinction matters. They're learning to celebrate my accomplishments without taking ownership of them, to support my work without making it about their redemption. The relationship we're building will never replace what was broken. The unconditional trust and automatic loyalty of biological family was destroyed by their choices during the worst crisis of my life. But we're creating something new, more honest, more intentional, and more resilient. We can't be your parents the way we were, Dad said during our most recent dinner. But maybe we can be your parents the way we should have been. It's not the family reunion I once imagined, but it's the family accountability I needed. Sometimes, the best apology isn't words or gifts or dramatic gestures, it's sustained effort to become the people who deserved your love in the first place. The letter they sent was just the beginning. The real amends happen in monthly dinners where they listen without defending themselves, in advocacy work that honors my experience without exploiting it, and in their quiet support for the life I've rebuilt from the ruins of their betrayal. It's not forgiveness exactly, and it's not the relationship we had before, but it's honest. And after 3 years of lies from the people who should have protected me, honesty feels like its own kind of love. The Purple Heart certificate hangs in my living room now, properly framed and displayed next to photographs of my squad in Afghanistan, and my graduation from the VAS Vocational Rehabilitation Program. It's been 3 years since Marcus's conviction, and I'm finally comfortable having symbols of my service visible in my own home. The certificate itself is a replacement. Marcus had somehow obtained the original during his identity theft and had it framed in his apartment, claiming my honor as his own. When federal agents returned it after his arrest, I couldn't bear to look at it for months. It represented everything he'd tried to steal: my sacrifice, my recognition, my right to be proud of my service. But now it means something different. It's not just recognition of my wounds or my bravery, it's proof of my resilience. I survived combat, survived identity theft, survived family betrayal, and survived a federal trial that challenged my fundamental right to exist. The medal represents all of that survival. My life today would be unrecognizable to the broken man who was arrested at his own Purple Heart ceremony 4 years ago. I work as a veterans advocate, helping other service members navigate disability claims and benefit applications. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm using knowledge gained from my own bureaucratic nightmare to help others avoid similar trauma. The job came through connections I made during my legal battle. Rebecca Chen recommended me to a non-profit organization that provides free legal assistance to veterans dealing with benefit disputes. My lived experience with identity theft and federal bureaucracy made me uniquely qualified to help others facing similar challenges. Fletcher knows the system from both sides. My supervisor, Maria Santos, explained when she hired me. He understands what it's like to be victimized by bureaucracy and what it takes to fight back effectively. The work is emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying. I help veterans who've been denied benefits they've earned, families who've been victimized by financial fraud, and service members whose own relatives have exploited their military status. Each successful case feels like a small victory against the injustice I experienced last month. I helped a Navy veteran recover $23,000 in disability payments that his ex-wife had diverted to her personal account. The case reminded me of my own situation, but this time I was the advocate rather than the victim. "I don't know how to thank you," the veteran told me when his benefits were restored. "You saved my life." That phrase, "you saved my life," has become common in my work. Veterans facing bureaucratic nightmares often feel hopeless and abandoned, the same way I felt during the worst days of my identity theft crisis. Being able to provide hope and practical assistance transforms my own trauma into something meaningful. The veteran community that supported me during my legal battle has become my chosen family. Earl Rodriguez and I have coffee every Sunday morning, discussing everything from VA policy to baseball scores. Sergeant Major Williams visits whenever he's in Atlanta, bringing updates from our old squad and stories about his grandchildren. The relationships I've built through advocacy work have also created unexpected personal connections. 6 months ago, I met Sarah Chen, no relation to Rebecca, at a veterans support group I facilitate. She's an Army veteran who lost her right arm to an IED in Iraq and now works as a prosthetics technician. Sarah understands aspects of my experience that no one else can. She knows the frustration of phantom limb pain, the challenge of adapting to prosthetic devices, and the complex emotions that come with visible war wounds. She also understands the veteran community's code of honor and mutual support. When Fletcher talks about service, Sarah told Maria Santos recently, "You can hear the authenticity in his voice. He's not performing patriotism, he's living it." Our relationship is still new, but it's built on mutual respect and shared values rather than shared trauma. We both choose to define ourselves by our recovery and advocacy rather than by our wounds and losses. The house I bought with my restored VA benefits has become a gathering place for veterans who need support or just want to spend time with people who understand their experiences. My living room has hosted everything from benefit application workshops to informal counseling sessions for veterans struggling with PTSD. Your home feels safe, one young Marine told me after attending a support group meeting. It's the first place I've been where I don't have to explain or justify my service. Creating that safe space has been part of my own healing process. For 3 years, my identity was questioned and challenged by people who should have protected it. Now I provide space where other veterans' identities are automatically honored and respected. The financial recovery has been slower than the emotional recovery, but steady. Marcus's restitution payments come monthly from the federal prison systems, amounts deducted from his commissary earnings that barely cover the interest on what he stole. The real financial healing came through VA benefit restoration, settlement payments from identity theft litigation, and my salary from advocacy work. I'll never be wealthy, but I'm financially secure for the first time since my identity was stolen. The house is modest but comfortable. The car is reliable if not luxurious. The bank account has enough padding that I don't worry about unexpected expenses. More importantly, my credit is completely restored. The fraudulent accounts Marcus opened have been purged from my record. The debt he accumulated in my name has been legally transferred to him. My credit score is higher now than it was before his identity theft, thanks to careful financial management during my recovery. The relationship with my parents continues to evolve slowly. We have dinner once a month and exchange holiday cards, but the easy intimacy of family has been replaced by careful courtesy. They are part of my life now, but not central to it. The betrayal created permanent distance that good intentions can't completely bridge. Marcus will be eligible for parole in 8 years. I try not to think about what happens when he's released, whether he'll attempt contact or continue blaming me for the consequences of his choices. Rebecca Chen has helped me prepare legal protections, restraining orders, and notification requirements that will give me advance warning if he tries to re-enter my life. The most important thing, Rebecca told me during our final official meeting, is that you've rebuilt a life that doesn't depend on Marcus's cooperation or acknowledgement. Your identity is secure, regardless of what he does in the future. She's right. The identity crisis Marcus created taught me that real identity comes from within, from choices, values, relationships, and commitments, rather than documents and family recognition. He can't steal that anymore, because I don't need anyone else's permission to be who I am. The speaking engagements that began during my trial have evolved into a regular part of my advocacy work. I address military audiences about family financial protection, law enforcement groups about identity theft investigation, and veteran organizations about recovery from complex trauma. Your story gives people hope, Sarah observed after attending one of my presentations. Not false hope that everything will be perfect, but real hope that survival is possible. That distinction matters. I don't tell people that family betrayal is easily overcome, or that justice is automatically served. I tell them that resilience is possible, that support exists, and that identity theft doesn't have to define the rest of your life. Standing in my living room this morning, looking at my Purple Heart certificate and the photographs of people who've become my chosen family, I realized that Marcus's greatest failure wasn't getting caught, it was believing that identity could be stolen. In the first place, you can't steal someone's character. You can't counterfeit someone's integrity. You can't appropriate someone's relationships or values, or the essence of who they've chosen to become. Marcus spent 3 years trying to be me, but he never understood what that actually meant. Being Fletcher Livingston isn't about having the right documents or wearing the right medals or telling the right stories. It's about serving something larger than yourself, standing up for truth when it costs you everything, and choosing to help others even after you've been hurt. Those are choices Marcus never made and never could make. He could steal my name, but he could never steal my commitment to being worthy of it. My name is Fletcher Marcus Livingston. I am a United States Marine. I served my country with honor and continue serving my fellow veterans every day. I survived combat, identity theft, family betrayal, and a federal trial. I am exactly who I've always been. And finally, after 4 years of fighting for the right to exist, everyone else knows it too. The story that began with betrayal ends with purpose. The identity that was stolen has been restored stronger than before, and the life that was nearly destroyed has become a foundation for helping others rebuild their own. That's not the ending Marcus intended when he decided to steal my life, but it's the ending he made possible by forcing me to prove who I really was. Sometimes the greatest gift your enemies give you is the chance to show the world and yourself what you're truly made of.